loud. All right. Did everybody go to the keynote this morning? Yeah. I'm excited to speak here. It's Christmas morning. All right. So I wanted to start out with a few stories. The first story is about my mom. My mom monitors her TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, with periodic blood tests, and she gets the levels adjusted with medication. After one of those tests, the results came back over 10 times normal, and needless to say, she was very concerned. She was about to go to the doctor to get her meds adjusted when she and I happened to talk, and I said, well, why don't you rerun the tests at a different lab? Sure enough, results came back about within normal range, so happy end to that story. She did not have to adjust her medication based on a faulty reading. Another story is about my colleague. His daughter fell ill after they've traveled extensively, and the tests were coming back, though inconclusive. They had some very scary indications, maybe leukemia, maybe a severe infection. He, of course, was very worried, and he and I happened to chat, and I had my mom's story in the back of my head. So I said, why don't you rerun those tests before you make any sudden moves? He did that. The results were a lot better looking, and his daughter was on the mend, so there was a happy end to that story too. The last story is about my husband. Some years ago, he went for a routine physical. Doctor had some concerns from the exam, so she sent out for some blood work. Blood work came back with some elevated readings, still not conclusive, so the doctor thought more testing is warranted. She sent him out for a biopsy. Now, I'm going to come back to that story, but in the meantime, what are some of the patterns from those stories? Well, one of the patterns is that everyone, 100% of population, participate in healthcare. You are either a patient, or perhaps you're a provider, a physician, or you know and support someone who is. And healthcare these days relies on software very heavily. And of course, we're all here for domain-driven design, which helps us write good software. So we'll talk about how domain-driven design helps us create good software for healthcare. Disclaimer first, I have never been able to use all aspects of domain-driven design in healthcare. But the good thing is I'm also not dogmatic about any software development methodology. I tend to take most applicable things and use them. So we'll talk about those that I've successfully used. What do you need to know about healthcare? Well, the first thing you need to know about healthcare is it's a business. It's a huge business if you look at the numbers. And it's a global business. It's no longer accurate to think of healthcare as just going to your local doctor or your local hospital. We have telemedicine these days where you can get a consult from a specialist around the world. We have AI-assisted digital pathology and radiology where your films or your slides will get read by a machine learning algorithm first and then get looked over by a specialist, again, anywhere in the world. Patient samples cross borders for testing, and patients themselves cross borders for treatment. What else? It's a regulated industry. The subject of regulations will come up throughout. Now, there's many regulated industries, but probably few as heavily as and thoroughly as healthcare. And of course, there's constant change in the industry. It's very innovative. I've seen lots of change happen over the last couple of decades, and I talked about some of it already, but precision medicine, the field that I work in, another good example of it. It lets you tailor your treatment to your specific genomic profile rather than population averages. What you need to know about working in healthcare is it is one of the most rewarding jobs you'll ever have. Your daily work has material positive impact on patients' lives, and that is a rare offering from the industry. The other thing that you need to know about working in healthcare is it's going to be one of the more complex jobs that you're going to have. You have your regular complexities of software development that are layered with the science of medicine and the business of healthcare. So what I'll talk about today is what a software architect needs to know in order to succeed working in healthcare. So just a quick word about me. I'm a software engineer. I'm a software architect now. I work on large cross-functional solutions. I lead a team of engineers. We work in a clinical laboratory providing order to report solutions with heavy focus on integrations. I have worked in healthcare for many, many years. I've actually worked in a lot of verticals, but I always come back to the industry because I really love what it has to offer. The company that I'm very proud to work for is Guardant Health. We are a leading precision oncology company dedicated to conquering cancer with our comprehensive blood tests and advanced analytics. Guardant 360 is a liquid biopsy that has helped patients with advanced cancer select their treatment. Over 100,000 patients. Most people don't know what liquid biopsy is. It's a blood test. It's a blood test that analyzes what's called a cell-free DNA that's shed by the tumor into blood in very, very small concentrations. And that analysis for specific mutations allows you to select treatments that are specific to those mutations. Shameless plug, we're hiring. If you're looking to work for a really cool company and live in very sunny California, do join us. So the first thing that you need to know in order to succeed in healthcare is to put the patient first. It seems like a really obvious thing, but it is also the most important thing. And if there's one thing that you take out of today, this should be it. What does that mean in practical terms? So there's 3 areas that I look at. One is patient safety. Architect in healthcare should always adopt a mindset of examining solutions for patient safety concerns. Hopefully you guys are familiar with Hippocratic Oath. Architects should have an equivalent to that. Safety and quality is probably the most carefully designed, validated, and hardened aspect of any healthcare solution. Mistakes are costly in a number of ways. We worry about human error a lot, and human error is bad. We write software in order to eliminate human error. Any single doctor treating patient in an incorrect way is bad. But we also write software to scale ourselves, and any mistake we put in software is going to scale with that software. So if I'm a tutor and I'm teaching one person incorrect information, that is bad. But if I am a professor at a university teaching 300 people, or if a video on Khan Academy that hundreds of thousands of people view teaches them bad information, that is the scale of mistakes that software can introduce. Practically speaking, look for edge conditions. Identify and test all of your edge conditions. I already told you the story about my mom. You know, that test result clearly had a decimal point misplaced somewhere. You know, it was obvious to me. And we were lucky because that was easy to spot. It's an order of magnitude error on continuous monitoring scale. But there are more subtle things. There's your less than or equal, greater than or equal type of mistakes, rounding errors, all of which can have a material impact on the course of treatment. The second part of putting patient first is information, and that is information about the patient and for the patient. Despite huge leaps in electronic medical records, it is still too often difficult for patients to get access to their own information. You know, in the future, we'll all be microchipped with our own health data. Until that happens, we have to resort to a more arcane ways of carrying paper and USB sticks and disks with us. Access and portability of data is critical to continuity of care. If you go to a different doctor, if you move to a different city, you want to take your health data with you. That helps your next physician prevent things like medication interactions, prescribing either unnecessary or conflicting treatments. So you want to be able to take your data with you. We do have some health interop data standards, but their use is not as widespread as I'd like them to be. The second one is information for the patients. Now, in this day and age of Google, patients will research their conditions. That's table stakes. Unfortunately, what they often encounter in that research is a lot of overly complex, disjointed information that leaves them overwhelmed. Creating patient-centric portals that provide clear and actionable information can go a long way to lightening cognitive load for people who are trying to process a lot of new information under stress. Any information we provide should be a source of clarity and comfort, not confusion and additional stress. I want to go back to the story of my husband for just a minute. biopsy revealed a cancer diagnosis. And this is where we experienced all aspects of patient information issues. Access and portability was difficult. We did carry that paper and USB sticks with us. And it was really hard to find clear and actionable information. Lots of new vocabulary was introduced, words like biopsy and clinically actionable and standard of treatment and other scary words that end with an ectomy. I remember just going through mountains of websites trying to understand what is the current research, how does it relate to what his physicians are telling us, and put together a course of action. The last aspect of putting patient first is creating an ecosystem of value-added services that ensure good patient experience. I am really happy to say that the industry is generally trending that way. Good patient experience is no longer a nice to have, it's now, or not even a differentiator, it is now almost required. And remember that those services can take various shapes. One of the things that we did some time ago is created a predictive algorithm that calculated what we call a turnaround time, basically telling us when the test result is going to be ready and notifying physician of any delays. Our test results are used in treatment selection, so they're very eagerly awaited by patients. And we were cognizant of the fact that not everybody lives next to an advanced oncology center. Some travel a really long way in order to see their provider. So when they get to that appointment, we want them to have all the data they need to take the next steps. So it did three things for us. It ensured good patient experience, good physician experience, and a bonus number of phone calls to our customer service reduced dramatically because a lot of them were about when will that test result become available. Much like putting patient first is the most important thing for succeeding in healthcare. Identifying ubiquitous language is the most significant first step that domain-driven design offers us. If you've been to this conference, lots of things have been said about importance of ubiquitous language. I am here to confirm that all of them are true. It is that important. Ubiquitous language is absolutely critical in a very complex domain, healthcare. There's a lot of science there. Molecular diagnostics, the domain that I work in, is very complex. And I'm an engineer, I'm not a scientist. What I found is that engineers, and really human beings, when they deal with high complexity, they tend to substitute these complex words and concepts that domain experts operate in with simpler, more analogous concepts. Again, it's just a method for coping with complexity. Here's how healthcare domain complexity really affects ubiquitous language. I'm going to try and do this without offending any of my colleagues that work in banking, but there were a lot of banking examples throughout the conference, and I thought I'd use one. I claim that banking domain and that ubiquitous language is easier to understand. Why? Well, we're all grown adults here. We have bank accounts, we have credit cards, we know what a deposit is, a withdrawal is, a charge is. So if I go to work in banking, I have some basic ubiquitous language already down. I won't know what a derivative is, but that's some advanced stuff. It's not really the same way in healthcare. But wait a minute, didn't I just say that all of us participate in healthcare? I went to my physical, wasn't I exposed to the domain? Don't I know some ubiquitous language? Actually, no. There's a name for this. It's called layman's terms. Your domain experts, your physicians, choose different language for non-domain experts, for example, patients, to reduce the complexity for them. So as a regular participant in this domain, you don't get that exposure to the true domain language. Here's some examples of this complexity. There are some words that look synonymous to me. They might or may not mean the same thing. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, and only domain expert will know the difference. The learning curve is pretty steep there. This is why they have advanced degrees. There are some words that are very ambiguous. For example, a word report is used throughout my domain, and it is ambiguous. I can infer some things from context. For example, when I talk to my clinical development team, I know they're talking about investigational report. When I talk to research operations, I know they're talking about research report, even though they just say report. When I talk to client services team, they're talking about clinical report. I infer this from context, but these bounded contexts, as you've also heard through the conference, and I can really relate to that, by the way, they're not hard. They're not that well defined. They're fuzzy, they're porous. I make no assumptions, and I put qualifiers around those words. I will always say investigational report or clinical report. So always very exact with words. My favorite, of course, is abbreviations. Software people use a lot of abbreviations. Trust me, software people have nothing on healthcare people. They use so many, and they will mean totally different things if you have a different background. So I always ask, what does this one mean? What does that one mean? And I try to use all of the words instead of abbreviations. So we talked about patient a lot, and it makes sense to think about patient as our ultimate customer, but is it our only customer? If you think about retail or e-commerce ecosystem, the definition of customer is quite simple. Somebody will find a product or service, they will buy it, pay for it, use it, that's a customer. It's not quite the same in healthcare. If, say, you break your arm, it's not you who's going to find a service or a product, it's going to be your physician, provider, who finds a service. It's going to be yet another provider, a radiology lab that fulfills that service, and yet another third party, let's say a government or a private payer, that pays for the service. So you already have 3 types of customers: patients, providers, and payers. Regulator is also your customer. In order to have a healthcare product on the market, you have to comply with regulations. And they oversee pretty much every aspect of other customers. They oversee providers, payers, sometimes even patients. Their needs are different, their objectives are different. Patient wants to get good care quickly. Physician wants to provide good care. They want to stay compliant with all the regulations, and they also want to get paid at the end of their service. Payer wants to, any guesses? Yeah, nobody gets to pay. They want to be efficient with payments. Value-based payments are a big thing. They also want to stay compliant with all the regulations, and they don't want to get defrauded. And of course, a regulator wants to ensure compliance and address any issues that might arise. There's more roles. There's study coordinators, there's customer service, there's physician staff. So when they talk about patient care team, there really is a team of people with various roles and responsibilities. Oh, too far. I talked about ubiquitous language and how important it is. There's another aspect to the ubiquitous language in healthcare, and that is customer-facing ubiquitous language, which can differ from customer to customer. This is an example of a transformation that data and corresponding language takes on in the course of a single test performed. You have raw data that comes off the machines that is used by other software for analysis and quality checks. You have analyzed data that's used by scientists to do research and to create clinical report. You have your clinical report that's used by a clinician to identify treatments and talk to patients. And finally, you have a patient version of report that helps patient with treatment selection. So there's a lot of nuance to the data as it goes through the process. Why is it important to know who your customer is? Aren't they all our customers? To some degree, yes. But if you don't know exactly who your customer is, you're risking solving a wrong set of problems. When I built a very first iteration of customer ordering portal, we thought initially that our customers were physicians. After all, they order laboratory tests, they have to sign a test, all that good stuff. Turned out that we were wrong. Physicians do order laboratory tests, but they're far too busy to do the actual work of ordering. They give that to their staff. So we had to very quickly solve different sets of problems. How do you delegate work from physician to their staff member? How do you obtain electronic signature not from, but on behalf of a physician? How do you remove that delegation when staff member leaves practice? So we solved for wrong customer initially. In addition to knowing who your customer is, you want to know how they operate. And that can be surprisingly hard in healthcare. Physicians are busy treating patients, patients are busy getting better, and there's a good probability that you're locked away in some IT dungeon without any access to any of them. Not having access to your customer makes it difficult to create an effective solution. So how do we overcome this? One of the ways is talking to customer proxies. These are people who interact with your customers on a regular basis, your client services, maybe salespeople who visit sites. They give you really good information about how your customers work. Surveys is a good high engagement way of getting information, voice of customer, usability studies, maybe even healthcare conferences. Keep in mind that that data does go stale, does need to be refreshed periodically, and you do need a good, large and representative sample in order to get good information. The less engaging, but still really good way to get information is embedding feedback mechanisms. These are things like on-page feedback buttons, automated telemetry reporting, error reporting, maybe even A/B testing for some of your more advanced customers. These all give you good data, but that method has a drawback as well. Sometimes healthcare organizations are closed ecosystems. They don't allow reporting out. And of course, your customers need to opt in. And last but not least, if ever you get a chance to observe your customer, even without engaging and interviewing, do take that. You glean a lot of really good information from just watching them. So all of this information that you've collected through various methods becomes input into your event storming. Problem definition is important. And because your customers are so diverse, the participants in event storming are diverse and numerous. They include anybody from R&D, quality, regulatory, supply chain, regional experts. This is all in addition to your software and software quality teams. Because that shared understanding is so critical, you want to make sure that everybody is included. And this, as you just heard, is a fairly long list. If any of you know the 3 blind men and an elephant fable, I call it touching the elephant. Everybody gets to describe their piece of the elephant, and we put it together from those descriptions. Sometimes it's a pretty mutated elephant initially that we have to fix. We can start identifying some bounded contexts here, but at this point, it's still a little bit fuzzy, and there's more inputs needed to get cleaner context. I'll talk about those. So we can't talk about healthcare without talking about regulations. Healthcare, of course, is a regulated industry, and depending on what your enterprise does and where it operates, you could be subject to a whole alphabet soup of regulations. Now, those can range, very interestingly, from very clear and prescriptive on one end, and very vague and needing interpretation on the other. For me, it's always been hard to grasp the grayscale there. But this is where I engage with my legal and compliance team. They will help you, first of all, identify the salient points of the regulation. And working with them, you can design a solution that is compliant with the regulation. So, first thing to do is identify a set of regulations. Get a complete set. Sometimes you're regulated by multiple regulatory bodies, which gets interesting because those regulations can conflict between each other. My favorite examples, say GDPR, their data retention policies, right to be forgotten, and US state and federal data retention policies are in conflict. So here you can start identifying some solutions already to see if one size will fit all or whether you have these bounded regulatory contexts. The thing that you need to remember is regulator is always your stakeholder and their requirements are mandatory. Can't get away from those. Within regulated environment, you don't just need to know what is being regulated. The what is usually pretty easy. It's safety and efficacy of the solution, but also how it's being regulated. Certain types of medical devices, and when I say devices, hardware and software, fall under this very stringent process called design controls. Now, if you guys Google design controls, you usually end up with a picture like this. If it looks waterfallish, that's because it is. And this process is a lot less emergent design and a lot more scientific method. You posit a hypothesis, you design an experiment, and then it either proves out or it doesn't. The reason for this process is pretty obvious. You want to prove that you've built what you set out to build. I'll give you an example. If you set out to build a toothbrush, which, by the way, if you don't know, is considered a Class 1 medical device, and what you end up with is a tongue depressor, which is also a medical device, you can't really prove its safety and efficacy by seeing if it'll clean your teeth. So for every set of changes, you have to go back and set up your experiment again. Making changes to design control software is costly because it incurs a heavy regulatory cycle. You saw that waterfall, you have to go back, redesign, validate, verify, start over again. What helps in order to minimize the cost of that change is creating bounded context around the regulation. So if you can identify the heart that's your device in the bounded regulated context, you can separate it from the rest of your software stack, and you can put in anti-corruption layers in order to, I don't want to say decouple, it's loosely couple. I heard a lot about coupling just now, so I'm going to be careful with the words that I use. But it helps minimize that cost of change. If I have a system around this regulated device, let's say a workflow that I want to execute my business processes with, or an ERP system where I order my supplies and recognize revenue, I want to be able to make changes to those a lot more rapidly than I do to my regulated space. Survey regulatory trends. Don't act on them too early, but at least survey them to know what's coming so you can do some long-term planning. I've seen, for example, FDA try to regulate lab-developed tests at least 3 times. They never came through with it, so if you start too early, you likely end up with wasted effort, but do be aware of what's going on. And last but not least, with regulations come audits and inspections. In my experience, architects are often called on to talk to auditors to effectively describe how a given solution complies with regulations. The way I want my audit to go is I want to talk to the auditors as little as possible because I have better things to do with my day, and I want them to ask me as few questions as possible. That is my perfect audit. And in order to get to that audit perfection, we need to produce artifacts. What kind of artifacts? Typically, it's some combination of business processes, data flows, integration catalogs, and security diagrams. If those are maintained and kept up to date and refined, at some point they start serving in audits with very little or no voiceover from you, which is great. I am, again, not dogmatic about any tools or notations that you use for creating those. Use whatever works for you. Just don't expect your consumer to understand what things mean. So explain directly on the artifacts why you used a particular color or a box or a dashed and dotted line. So have those legends be available. And there is a huge bonus to these. They are reusable. You can use them for anything from your new team member onboarding to if you have new partnerships coming up. Usually potential partners, when they do due diligence, they ask for a very similar set of artifacts. All right, I'm going to talk about security very briefly. It gets a lot of attention these days, as well it should. Every healthcare solution comes with security considerations. We deal with PHI, protected health data, which by definition needs to be protected. Breaches result in business disruption, they result in reputation risk, not to mention penalties from regulators and lawsuits, and we want to avoid those. The stories are endless. I can stand there and talk for an hour about all the breaches that occurred. A couple of examples are big ones. Anthem, which is a US private insurer, had a breach. exposed data on 79 million users, settled a lawsuit for $115 million that did not include any remediation efforts they had to expend. So that was not the end of their expenses. NHS, the National Health Service in UK, their computers fell victim to a ransomware virus, and it was bad enough that they had to cancel appointments and surgeries. So those stories, there's many more of those. Addressing cybersecurity risk comes, or cybersecurity threat comes to risk mitigation. So what does it cost us if we mitigate the risk versus leave it untouched? You participate in the cycle of identifying the risk, estimating cost of remediation, prioritizing, doing remediation. One thing that I want to stress is it is a cycle. It is not a one and done effort. I talked about change. There's always change. Your technology might change. Your regulations sometimes change. Sometimes things are being asked for from partners. External threats change. All of these will restart a cycle. In order for you to manage these threats on a continuous basis, I generally recommend adopting a cybersecurity framework. There's many out there that will help you create a roadmap. And speaking of cycles, what I want to know is how my solution is doing. I want to find inefficiencies or problems, ideally ahead of my customers, and make improvements based on solid evidence. Now, there's already methodologies that deal with that. Lean Six Sigma in manufacturing, they basically deal with repeatability of process and reduction of defects. Healthcare enterprises do adopt those solutions, or those methodologies, but regardless of methodology, you want to have a live process improvement cycle, especially, we talked about earlier that defects in healthcare are quite costly. What does that cycle look like? Well, it's pretty simple. This is a good mature cycle. You have a process in which you collect data, which you periodically analyze. You identify improvements, queue them up, and implement them. I've seen the cycle look like this, where you have process, you collect data, but you don't do anything with this data. Not great, but it typically just indicates low maturity, and it's easy to improve. I've seen it look like this. You have process, but instead of data, you collect complaints from your customers. That's already problematic because your customers are reporting issues. And when you implement improvements, you don't actually know whether they're improvements at all because you don't have any solid data to verify those complaints against. They might have just reduced quality of work for some other part of your customer population. I've also seen it look like this, where you have process, you wait until problem occurs, you patch, and you hope for the best. I was a lead engineer on the project that went through the cycle. We released a pretty big update to our online ordering capability, and you always know it's bad news when you get woken up at 6 in the morning next day by your support engineer who says, oh, some of our customers in Europe are having trouble logging in. And then when you start troubleshooting, you realize you don't know why. You don't have data, you don't have telemetry, why some and not others, and how do we fix this thing? We did actually fix it pretty quickly, but the damage was done. We still had to do damage control with our customers. People were not happy that they couldn't do their work when they needed to do it. And of course, there's an implied delay to patients. We did learn from that we should have a continuous process improvement cycle in every project. What does that help us with? Well, there's lots of things. Of course, patient safety concerns is one, customer dissatisfaction, reputation risk, revenue loss. If people can't log in, they can't place orders, no revenue, non-compliance. There is a bonus to having this, and the bonus is it allows your value-added services to evolve serendipitously. Remember that turnaround time that I talked about? That was a direct result of us analyzing our order fulfillment process, looking for bottlenecks and improving it. It let us create that predictive algorithm. So all of this seems like a real no-brainer. Why don't we do this already? Well, a few challenges in healthcare is the processes are big. They're complex, they're arcane. Sometimes it's difficult to find a place where you can start. Another one is Sometimes this effort is perceived as lower value. Usually that's until an incident occurs. Other times, data collection can be hard. You have a lot of legacy systems, or you have regulatory constraints that prevent you from doing this. How do you overcome all this? The best thing you can do for yourself is find a sponsor. Somebody who will champion this effort. That somebody usually lives in quality or patient safety. Those are good people to champion those types of efforts. Define what it is, what your KPIs are, what you're measuring. Collect all the data you can. Make sure you comply with all the privacy regulations. Verify all of your complaints before making improvements on them. And this might be a good place to pilot use of machine learning algorithms. They let you have insights into your process trends pretty quickly. So going back to the story of my husband briefly. So the next chapter, of course, is treatment after diagnosis. 2 surgeries, even though only one was planned. Brief but very unpleasant radiation therapy. We did experience that process improvement cycle during the treatment. First surgery did not go as expected. Recovery was long and difficult, so physicians made a few adjustments, and the second surgery went much better, and recovery was much, much shorter. So the last big thing that I want to talk about is change. There's, of course, a lot of change in healthcare. I talked about a few aspects of it. How do we keep up with it? What I realized over all this change is there's no such thing as perfect architecture. Best you can do is understand what you need to do at this time, understand what your current constraints are, make trade-offs, and come up with the best solution for the given time. I've become a little weary of future-proofing. You never know what next invention or disruption is around the corner. These are really hard to predict. But at the same time, I want to create something that is easy to change when change is needed. So I need to invest in architecture that is flexible enough to evolve. Where do I invest? I'm an engineer, so I want my entire solution to be flexible and evolvable. I want all the ilities, everything is scalable, secure. The reality is building that type of solution for and throughout a large enterprise is costly. And I always have constraints. I have my time, budget, I have competitive, I have regulatory constraints. So I want to figure out where to make trade-offs so I can deliver the most impact. What I realize is there's this linear relationship between the rate of change in a certain area and the amount of investment that I want to make in the architecture that's flexible and evolvable. The more change, the more investment. And it helps to know that not every single aspect of healthcare solution evolves at the same rate. So we want to target the ones that evolve and change a lot more quickly. Let's talk about what they are. Patient safety is probably one of the most slow-moving aspects of any healthcare solution. The change there is not just slow, it's actually very controlled and deliberate. I'll give you this example. Let's say the safety limit of a particular treatment is 42, and you want to change it to 43. In order to change it to 43, you probably need to go through clinical trials, validation, regulatory approvals, pretty much everything that got you to 42 in the first place. So it's going to be a very controlled and deliberate process. Regulations tend to be similarly slow-moving. They don't sneak up on you, which, by the way, is a really good thing. They get deliberated in regulatory bodies. There's a comment period. They get ratified into laws. And then usually there's some period, grace period, that lets you become compliant. Once you've become compliant, there's not usually a lot of change. So integrations, interactions, and business rules are a completely different thing. If the days ever existed of a monolith serving a healthcare enterprise, they're gone now. A typical healthcare enterprise consists of a lot of applications that are fit for use. So you see a huge alphabet soup over there. you have a laboratory information management system, you have an ERP system, you have electronic medical records, you have doc management. So there's a ton of these platforms. Of course, they're liberally sprinkled with, your own custom homegrown software, your IP, your differentiators. And you probably have a separate set of systems that support R&D so that they don't interfere with standard business processes. Now, all these systems are expected to talk to each other, and they're also expected to support business needs as they evolve. And we all know that business needs are constantly evolving. We are building new products, we're making new partnerships, maybe there's changes in supply chain, so always moving. All these systems are highly stateful and they're highly workflow driven. There's a lot in healthcare that is driven by workflow. And they need to provide a multitude of cohesive business processes that go through, they evaluate these business rules, so lots of forks in a road. Some of those are known in advance, some of them are emergent. We want to be able to adapt quickly so that we can implement those emergent rules quickly. Where does that leave us from the architecture standpoint? Well, you heard this earlier, big ball of mud. The term that I actually like better is distributed big ball of mud. It perfectly describes this architecture. So lots of commercial systems, heavily customized, and lots of homegrown software. How do we detangle this? So here's where domain-driven design helps us in a couple of different ways. First of all, identifying subdomains and their types. This analysis should inform your build versus buy decisions. You've seen something like this before. You build core, supporting, in my experience, you can likely buy and customize, sometimes heavily. And of course, you buy generic. Two main challenges in healthcare. There is rarely a perfect or even a good enough out-of-the-box solution. And the knee-jerk reaction that we all have is we can build it. So we try to build it. Part of it is because some of the things that we do are pretty cutting edge and there really isn't anything, but the evaluation is not often done to the degree where you could say, yes, this truly doesn't exist and we should go ahead and build it. Focus your investment on true core domains. I've seen a lot of this desire to roll your own that, especially in service layers, that introduces pretty heavy complexity, but has very questionable value. So, abstraction on top of abstraction. As you know, everything in computer science can be solved with another layer of indirection, and we do that a lot. But I've actually seen attempts to build pretty major platforms like CRM and LIMS, and unless you're making it part of your core business, you're going to sell that LIMS, you're going to sell that CRM, stay away. Value prop analysis is important. Always ask what problem are you solving with this, and has it been solved before? Can we find something that solved this problem before? The second challenge is with the distribution of the subdomains. Normally, you'll have some core, some supporting, some generic. Everything leans very heavily into core. Even supporting domains require so much investment, they almost become core domains, even though they're not really, there's no differentiators. And when a domain becomes commoditized and effectively goes to generic, it takes a long time for a healthcare enterprise to get rid of what they have, which may not be supporting their needs anymore, and really truly go to generic. So you end up supporting these solutions that have outlived themselves. So there's quite a few subdomains in healthcare. These are specific to a clinical laboratory. This is my life, so I identified those here. I could argue that many of them are core. Most of them are core, especially considering the investment. Obviously, R&D, manufacturing, sample processing, even order and customer management ends up being a very heavy investment supporting domain. Probably reimbursement is the only one that we can commoditize out, but everything else is something that we manage in-house. More importantly, I drew these pretty cleanly, and it is PowerPoint, I can do whatever I want in it, but the reality is not that neat. And I tried to depict one of the bigger problems that I've encountered, bigger challenges, I should say, that I've encountered in healthcare. A single commercial platform facilitates multiple domains. and multiple bounded contexts. What this means is, well, the platform is heavily customized. There's no harmonization of requirements. They're often in conflict. And really, true boundaries are very hard to establish because you're living in the same application on the same data model. What does that mean? It means that the teams that work on it, the only ways to work on it is partnership, cooperation. There is no, there's very little separation. They become very mutually dependent teams, and that should inform your team and org structure, but it doesn't often. So it's another challenge that I tend to run into frequently. As we venture into solution space, domain-driven design helps us further decompose things into more bounded contexts. So what I use for that decomposition are three main factors. Business, of course, but also regulatory and volatility. Essentially, what I invest into is a total cost of change. And in order for me to target that change, I want to try and isolate it and contain it. So if you can create a bounded context around something that changes quickly, I'd say you're winning. When I consider volatility, I don't just consider volatility within a bounded context, but also an interaction with bounded contexts. We know that they don't live in isolation, they interact with each other, and sometimes those interactions change pretty dramatically. So investing in architecture that is highly volatile and bounded context often means that you establish anti-corruption layers. You don't want that change in one to flow into another. And this is one of the main paradigms that I use. If you can put an anti-corruption layer, do that. I also inspect regulatory aspect pretty closely. Now, I talked about regulatory and your regulation's not changing very quickly, so there's not a lot of volatility. But because the cost of change is high, it's worth isolating your regulated bounded context so your total cost of change is contained somewhere. So these bounded contexts, they vary in color. The warmer the color, the more volatility there is. The cooler, the less volatility there is. Same with the arches and overlaps. They indicate interactions. And what's interesting there is, at first glance, you would think that if the bounded context is very volatile, the interaction with it will be very volatile. And most of the time, it's true. But sometimes you can have a very stable interaction with a very volatile bounded context. The example here is reimbursement. Reimbursement in US changes all the time. There's new rules. There's constant change. Part of the reason why we try to commoditize and outsource it to people who want to do that. But the interaction with it can actually be pretty stable. You know, hopefully you have some orders, you want to send them out to bill, and you get money back. So for a well-designed interaction, you can contain that change to that bounded context. Ooh, too far. So I know I'm almost at time. I want to close, or before I close, I want to go back to the story of my husband. The story also has a happy end. His treatment was several years back. He's fully recovered, and he is doing great. So summary, most important thing, putting patient first. Make sure you have all the regulations in play. Worry about security, but more importantly, worry about change. Try and contain that change, isolate it, invest in managing that change. And if you heard a lot of this from Kent Beck, I probably don't say it as well, but the themes are there. Thank you.